So Chapter 13, go ahead and log into SOCRAT for TSTC. We're going to talk about cryptography, the different terms that are used within it, what it means, and then some encryption algorithms, the differences between symmetric and asymmetric encryption, and basics for hashing algorithms today. So, got a little video of just talking about some of the different terms associated with cryptography. Cryptography is just the practice of hiding information in some way. So this video is going to go over some of the terms that come along with that.
Decrypt that message. It is all of these different...
Excuse me.
Cryptography is obviously extremely important in what we are doing today with our networks and our computers. The term cryptography comes from the Greek word kryptos, which means hidden or secret. That's exactly, obviously, what we're doing when we're talking about cryptography. There are a number of features that cryptography brings to the table. One is confidentiality. This is the one we normally think about. We're going to send our credit card information across the internet. We want to be sure that nobody in between would be able to see that credit card information. All of that information absolutely secret. Nobody's able to see it except for me and the person that I'm sending it to. Everything else completely confidential. The authentication and access control is also a capability that's provided to us through cryptography. This authentication method means that if I'm putting in a username and then a password, the cryptography around that password and the way that we keep it secret validates that it is me. I'm able to send that message in an encrypted form, and the other side is able to validate that that is indeed exactly the person I would be expecting there. There's also a capability called non-repudiation, which means if I receive a message from you, there's no way you can say that you did not send this. I can really tell that this was you that sent it. There's no way you can deny what you put into this message, because I have a way to determine that it really did come from you and that you really did write these things. And that also brings us to integrity. We know that when we receive this message and we check it with these cryptography and the methods that we're going to talk about, that we can be assured that nobody has tampered with anything inside of this message. If anybody was to change one word or one letter, we would be able to notice it. And cryptography makes sure that when we receive a message, we can be sure that it was not tampered somewhere along the way. There are a number of common terms you'll need to know about cryptography. The first is plain text. Before you encrypt anything, it is plain text, or something that we sometimes will call in the clear. If we were to send this information out over the network, anyone would be able to read it. We haven't done any type of hiding or encrypting of this message. Once we do encrypt the information, it becomes ciphertext. We have taken our plain text, we've applied a cipher to it, and the resulting encrypted information is the ciphertext. That cipher is what we're using to encrypt that message. It's an algorithm, it's a mathematical method that we're using to take the plain text and encrypt it or convert it into something that people can't read. And that is the cipher that allows us to do that. The art of cracking this encryption then is cryptanalysis. Having your cryptographers in a government facility trying to understand and make sure that the messages that they are sending are secure, and trying to crack the messages that are coming from other places is a big, big business. And even though it's something that is relatively hush-hush and top secret, it's something that is happening every day. There are many different ways to scramble up a message and encrypt it in a way that no one would be able to read it. One common way is something called a substitution cipher. This is one of the oldest methods that you'll find of encrypting data. This is also called Caesar's cipher, because Caesar is one of the people that originated this method of sending information back and forth and certainly made it very popular. What he did was take a normal alphabet and he changed all of the letters down a certain number. In fact, a very common one is row 13. You've rotated this group 13 steps to the right, so that instead of writing the letter A, you would write the letter N. Instead of writing the letter B, you would write the letter O. So your cipher is really this 13. As long as you know the number 13, you can take a message and encrypt it and decrypt it with that particular key. This is obviously something that would turn this funny looking message into hello world. It's a very simple one to do. And it made it very easy to send this message. It's encrypted, you can't read it. You would have to know exactly what you would need to do, how many methods, how many sections you needed to move this down and rotate it to be able to read that message. Another type of cipher is a transposition cipher, where we keep exactly the same letters, but we just scramble them up and put them in a different format. And then you would provide the person on the other end with the key, what letters should go in what position, and they would transpose them back into the order that it was designed so that you could make hello world out of this scrambled bunch of letters that has exactly the right letters in it, they're just all in the wrong place. We often see people trying to figure out these particular sections of ciphertext, and one of the methods that they'll use, especially on these older substitution ciphers and transposition ciphers, is to use frequency analysis. They'll examine the entire ciphertext and they'll try to determine how many times do I see the letter R, how many times do I see the letter Q, how many times do I see the letter W. And they'll start creating a frequency table of how many times we're seeing different characters. And if we think that this is the English language, we know the letter E is certainly one of the most popular letters, T is the second most, A is the third most, O is the fourth most, and so on. And you can start substituting in some of these frequencies that we're seeing in our ciphertext to try to figure out exactly what the real message might be inside of that ciphertext. Well, obviously in modern times, a Ch13 or a transposition cipher is not really going to keep things very safe. So we've started to see things like mechanical ciphers appear around the World War II timeframe. This is one that Germany used. This is an Enigma machine, which took a message and encrypted it using a piece of machinery, which means you would have to have this piece of machinery on one end and this piece of machinery on the other end to be able to decrypt the messages that were being sent back and forth. Being able to hack or crack that particular encryption code was an extremely important part of what happened during World War II. A lot of interesting history there. There are also mathematical ciphers, and these are the ones that we will probably see the most of, especially in modern times, because if you can make it a very, very complex cipher, and obviously it will be very, very, very difficult to be able to decrypt that message in some way. And we're going to go through a number of mathematical ciphers, not just in this video, but many others where we will talk about hashing, we'll talk about doing symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. If you're at all interested in getting into cryptography, you will need to have an extremely strong background in mathematics. We've talked a little bit so far about keys. We've talked about if you know what the key is, then when that encrypted message gets on the other side, you can apply a key to it with the correct cipher and come up with the plain text, back to the information we wanted to get our hands on. These keys can be very simple, like the Ch13 key, we needed that number 13. That was the important part of it. If it's something like PGP or GPG, we'll talk more about those as well. The keys are very, very complex. This is my public key, for instance, that I use when I start encrypting information using some asymmetric encryption methods. So you have to make sure you have the right kind of key for the message that you're getting so that you can encrypt it properly. Another cryptography technique is a one-time pad. This is one where you would have a page of letters. On one side, you have exactly the same page of letters on the other side. The person who's encrypting the message will go through each letter of the message, and they would combine the first letter of this pad with the first letter of the message to come up with ciphertext. Then the second letter of the pad with the second letter of the plain text message to come up with the next letter of the ciphertext, and so on. They would go all the way through your plain text message to create the ciphertext. And obviously this would be very, very difficult to be able to decrypt unless you had this exact key on both sides. You have to have that exact pad of paper, which is where the one-time pad comes from. You use that message one time, you get rid of it, and you have a completely new key, a completely new one-time pad to be able to use. You use it one time and you're done. So the next message, even if the first message was decrypted in some way, the second message, someone would have to start all the way from the beginning again to try to decrypt that message. It is all of these different cryptography methods and cryptography features that really provide us with a very, very powerful way to keep all of our information private on our computers and across our network.
Okay, so he went through a lot of these terms, but what I do want to focus on is, remember, he mentioned the CIA and the non-repudiation and the things that this means. So if a written message is intercepted and you don't have the key, you can't figure out what the message is. So that's our confidentiality component. If you have the key, you must be the person that's supposed to read this, otherwise why would you have the key? That's kind of an authentication characteristic. If you sent this, you use this key to send it, you can't refute that you're the one that sent it. That's a non-repudiation. When I decrypt it, I know it hasn't been tampered with because when I decrypt it with my key, it's not nonsense, garbled junk, it means something. So that is integrity. I know that data hasn't been changed, or when I tried to decrypt it, it wouldn't turn out right. And then anyone that has the key can go get that file anytime they want. That's the availability component. So all these things are provided to us with cryptography. That key, again, that's the piece that determines the output. There's two different kinds of keys. There's a public and a private. The public key is basically, it's public knowledge is a way to look at it. We're going to talk about when you would use that. The private key is just the user that's using it and no one else needs to know it. If that key gets out anywhere else, we don't have a confidential situation anymore. But that key means quite a bit. We talk about symmetric versus asymmetric algorithms. Symmetric ones have the same key to encrypt and decrypt. Symmetric, same, right? Symmetric keys are private keys. So for some reason it always stuck with me to think, keep your symmetry private. And that's how I remember that symmetric algorithms use private keys. So this requires, when you think about it, if you've got to have the same key to encrypt and decrypt, at some point you have to give the person who needs to decrypt the key, right? You can't just send it and then send the key with it because that doesn't really do any good. It's not confidential. Anybody that intercepted the message would be able to get to it. So you have to have some sort of exchange of this key for this to work. So when we talk about symmetric algorithms, we can put those up here on our board. So we have the DES, which is the DES, the triple DES. That's what we're going to start with. The RC, and the AES that fall under our symmetric keys. There's a couple different ways you can do that. You can do a stream cipher, which is just one byte of the message at a time, or a block cipher, which is a block, a predetermined block. 64 bits worth, 128 bits worth, some predetermined amount worth. The blocks can be different sizes.
That's what, is that what general encryption uses now? Is block ciphers? Like 120 bit or 256
Generally,
bit?
yes, because doing bit by bit by bit takes
From
longer.
the net.
Right. So when we think about symmetric keys, what I want you to think about is large amounts of data. That's one of the things symmetric is used for, a very large amount of data. Because it takes less time to encrypt and decrypt when the key's the same. That's the only reason. So a good example of that is BitLocker. So BitLocker is a Microsoft function that encrypts an entire hard drive. You would use a symmetric key with that because it will be faster, right? Asymmetric keys are just a tiny bit more complicated. So you're going to use a pair of keys. So the private key, and then you're going to have a public key. The public key is going to be the one that's more common, it's out there. The keys are related mathematically, but you have two different keys. So that also brings up the point of, hey, if I have two different keys, I have to get that other person their key so they can decrypt my message. So I have to deliver two keys instead of just one. So some of our asymmetric algorithms are the RSA, the Diffie-Hellman, and the ECC. There's a couple more that we're going to talk about as we go through, but this is kind of our foundation. When I walked into the Security Plus, you know, they give you the little scratchy pad that you can write on and erase. I wrote down what I'm writing up here. That was going to be my key to remember all this stuff. And we'll talk about ways that we can remember what goes in what category. So when we talk about public key cryptography, so if symmetry is private, our asymmetry asymmetric, maybe that's a word, is our public cryptography. So you can use those. There's some systems that just use asymmetric, or maybe they'll use a combination of the two. The public key is the one that's well known and anybody can use it to decrypt. But the private key is the one that is supposed to be secret and used to be decrypted. So only the owner of the private key can decrypt the message. The whole security of the system is based on the private key being kept private. If anyone else gets the private key, well, they can decrypt the message too. We'll talk next week about certificates, and maybe that'll kind of start to make a little more sense. We'll talk about how this stuff is used in practical applications as well. So that is what public key cryptography is. So here's an example of this. So Bob is sending a memo. The memo's in plain text, which just means nothing's been done to it yet. It's in the clear. It goes through an encryption algorithm with Alice's public key. Alice is the receiver of this message. Her public key is public, so someone else can use it. It goes through, it turns into ciphertext, it gets transmitted. She uses her private key that only she has to be able to decrypt it, and then she can see the memo. Any questions about that?
So is it a flip thing, like public key, everyone has access to, the private is something you have?
So if they wanted to send a message the opposite way, if Alice wanted to send a message to Bob, she would encrypt it with Bob's public key, and he would decrypt it with his own private key.
So the recipient, if you're sending something to somebody, you use the recipient's public key, and then the recipient uses their private key.
Exactly.
So lock.
And that's,
Exactly.
And so
You would not believe how
they
long
would
it
use-
took me to figure that out.
They would use your public key to send something, and you use your private to lock open.
Yes, exactly. That is the process.
In the message, are you sending out both? Or is like
No. Generally, and we'll talk about that next week, generally, it's gonna have happened ahead of time before you even knew you needed to send anything.
No, that you shouldn't, but could you send your private key?
You could, but like, if you think about man-in-the-middle attacks or something, if that message was intercepted with the key in it, then they have your key from now on. They can decrypt anything you send.
Are we gonna do something hands-on like this?
Yes. We have a really cool encryption lab. It's kind of hard. You have to really pay attention. But we're going to actually watch RSA encryption in action. I did not build that lab, by the way. I did not take any credit for it. But it's really cool. I did it last Friday just as a test to see what it was like, and it was neat. Okay, so when we talk about public key cryptography, the private keys can be used to sign the message. A digital signature, we're going to talk about certificates and stuff. Remember, our public key is our asymmetric key. If the private key gets compromised, what happens? Private key is supposed to be kept private. Nobody else is supposed to get it.
yeah.
So what do we do if we have that compromised?
You have to get another key.
You have to get another key, which means you're going to have to get another public key. It's going to be a big deal, right? So next week we're going to talk about the different kinds of ways that thing happens. A digital signature authenticates a document and lets the recipient of that document know that it was created and sent by the actual sender and not by someone else posing as them. Yeah.
Are we discussing asymmetric or symmetric at this point?
Public is asymmetric. Right. So anytime you're talking about a private and a public key, generally it's going to be pointing towards something asymmetric.
So symmetric is public.
Asymmetric is public. Symmetric is private. So this digital signature is basically something signing off saying this message or this document was actually sent by Alice. It says it was sent by Alice, but this proves that it actually was. So when she sends a message, her private key proves that she's the one that actually sent it. Unless that key's been compromised, and then we know she needs a new one. There's some examples of this. SSL does this. So we know SSL is the protocol that we use for HTTP to make sure that it's secure. It's essentially doing things like this. And also PGP, which stands for pretty good privacy, which is hilarious to me. They also use public key cryptography. So there's a couple of examples. When we look at the process for this, there's 4 steps involved in it. So if we look back especially at that instance, the first thing that happens is it gets encrypted. Oh, actually, I already have this. It gets encrypted right at the first green arrow with the key. Then it gets digitally signed. There's the digital signature that gets attached to it. Then it goes down and gets decrypted. And then we verify that the sender and the receiver, that their digest match. We're going to talk about digest in a second. But the process, there's a 4-step process when it comes to cryptography. Encrypt, sign, decrypt, and verify. So Bob makes a memo. It creates a digest. A digest is ensuring that it's Bob that sent it, right? It hasn't been compromised. It encrypts it with his private key. He sends the memo with that digital signature over on the second green arrow. Alice gets it. She decrypts it with Bob's public key. If she can't decrypt it, like her key doesn't work, for instance, she knows it didn't really come from Bob. So that's the signature part, the verification of the sender. The memo is hashed to ensure integrity. We'll talk about hashing in a minute. But if the digest doesn't match, she knows the message was changed since he last signed it. But in this case, the digest matches, so we know that it really did come from Bob. Another thing to talk about is steganography. We're going to do another lab on this as well. This is pretty cool. So this is what you would call the science of writing hidden messages inside of other things. It's a form of what we call security through obscurity. So if no one knows to look for it, it's pretty secure, because nobody's going to try. Right? Silly, but it actually works a lot of times. So no one aside from the sender and the receiver should even suspect that there's a hidden message inside whatever that document is. It's done a lot with pictures. And that's what we'll be doing on Thursday. We'll be doing that with pictures. So this could be used by security administrators. It could be used by hackers for different purposes. But especially when we use a graphic file to send a hidden message. The phrase to remember, especially on this slide, is the least significant bit of every byte of information is replaced. And that's just enough to hide something in the message, but just a small enough amount of change that it wouldn't be suspected, and to the naked eye, you don't see a difference. So if we change a message, which of course everything is in binary, so it shows the message in binary form, but that can mean lots of different things. And it's actually inserting data, metadata into the picture, so data about the picture. It's inserting stuff into it, but you can see over on the right-hand side, it just looks like the Statue of Liberty. To the naked eye, you would never know if there was anything hidden in that picture, unless you had the right tools to get the hidden information out. Okay. So let's talk about our different symmetric algorithms. The first one we talked about was DES, then triple DES, and then AES. So DES is really, really old. It was used in the 70s. In general, when you see something that says it has a lower bit number cipher, it's less secure. So in the beginning, we had a 64-bit cipher. So when the cipher is not that large, it's going to be more easily cracked. Once an encryption algorithm has been cracked, we don't use it anymore. We figure out a better way. We add more to it, or we change something about it, so that it's useful again. We don't want the encryption to be cracked, but there's kind of no point in having the encryption. If anything, it's just, hey, they won't crack it as quickly, right? Triple DES is the same as DES, except it does 3 different ciphers. So it'll do one DES cipher and have something be encrypted, and then do it again, and then do it again. So you end up with a little bit more complex of a cipher, but it's not in use anymore. Both of those are deprecated. Now AES, if you go back to your Network Plus day, you remember that WPA2 encryption in wireless uses AES. So this is actually in use all the time around us. So this is the successor. You can have different versions of block ciphers. So like you were asking, that's a block cipher, not a stream, right? So it can do 128 bits at a time, 192, or 256. And it uses that substitution permutation. AES is also used in that BitLocker, as I talked about, with the symmetric key, large amounts of data. When we think about it, Wi-Fi has a lot of data that goes through it as well, right? AES is the thing that's encrypting that. So between these 3, if I had to pick one that wasn't deprecated, I would pick AES because the ciphers are larger, right? And it hasn't been compromised. So as far as what you need to know on the test, you would need to know that these aren't used and this is, and their names. That will get you through most questions.
You said that DES through RC is used.
Well, what we talked about, DES, triple DES, and AES. So these 2 are actually still in use and these aren't.
What is RC again?
We're gonna answer, we haven't talked about it yet. It stands for Ron's code, because a guy named Ron made it.
Ron's code.
A lot of these things stand for people's,
It says Rivet cipher.
yeah, it's Ron Rivest. And like when you look at further in like RSA encryption, that's named after him too. Apparently he's big on making encryption algorithms. So there's some of our symmetric keys. We've got a few more to talk about. The Rivest cipher, or Ron's code for short, is another one of those on our list. So we have different versions of that. So there's like RC 4, 5, and 6. Sometimes they'll just kind of be playing around with encryption algorithms, something I'll break, and we won't use that anymore. I think that happened with RC5. So RC4 is a stream cipher. So it uses bit by bit, changing things over. And it is used in SSL and WEP. Do we use SSL all that much anymore?
Yes.
It's got a replacement. Do y'all know what that is? TLS is the new SSL. So more things, we're kind of in the process of changing into TLS based stuff. But in general, it's considered to be breakable, so we don't use it anymore. Do we use web encryption and wireless anymore? No, right? We know because we've talked about why that's not a secure wireless standard. So RC4 is used in things that generally have deprecated. RC6, a block cipher. So they have a big competition every year to come up with new versions of cryptography, which is pretty cool. Lots of math majors there that day, I'm sure. So RC6 wasn't exactly picked as something that people would use, but it's known as being a legitimate encryption algorithm. So in our RCs, we've got RC4 and RC6. We've also got blowfish and twofish. So those are based off a different algorithm. They're not used very much. You just need to know that they exist. So when you look at this list, do you have any commonalities that would help you remember just the symmetric encryption? I can only think of one.
Asymmetry?
This one.
The AES is used for the least-spoken meter memory using the wireless network.
Okay.
And then the DES and triple DES were used in the 70s, so they're and
I just trying to remember about those three.
Yeah. This is the way I remember it. This is stupid. This is stupid. Most of the ways I remember things are done, but they weren't, right? Look, S. Yeah. Most of them have S's in it. The R's are the only ones that are kind of split. That's how I remembered it on the test.
Okay.
That helps at all.
Like, how are the questions like worded in the test? Like,
Oh, heavens above.
Yeah, because if they're like, what's the best version of blah, 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 those are like the worst, those are the worst
No,
questions to
okay,
ask.
so if they were to ask you, what's the best version of symmetric encryption, what would you answer?
Yes.
AES. Which of the following forms of symmetric encryption are no longer in use? And they gave you that, and that.
would it ever give you some random log and to ask
Yeah.
you what encryption is using?
No. They do not expect you to actually understand the mathematics behind encryption. You need to know the differences between them and where they fall.
I don't have to be a cryptographer.
You do not have to be
Okay.
a cryptanalyst. Cryptanalyst? Whatever, a cryptographic expert to
There you
pass a
go.
security plus. You need to know what category things go in. You need to know which ones are still used. If you want super extra bonus points, you can remember the block sizes and whether it's a string or a block cipher. At one point, I knew some of those things. You don't use it, you lose it, right? Okay. Another strategy for remembering this, I had a student, like I explained all that last semester, and I had a student go, well, why don't you just remember the asymmetric list, because there's only 3 things in it, and I'm like, makes perfect sense to me, man. I do not think of that. Okay. Any other questions about symmetric encryption? We know it uses the same key. Keys are linked together.
One of the internet's most popular encryption algorithms is RSA. This RSA stands for Ron Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Edelman, and it was published back in 1977. It uses this public key cryptography system where you have a public key and a private key to be able to encrypt information, decrypt that data, and even digitally sign information. This is based on an idea of finding the product of 2 extremely large prime numbers. You have to be able to understand those 2 factors to be able to decode all of this information. That's a very simplified way of describing how this works, but it does provide us with some great capabilities of sending encrypted data across the network and ensuring that it will be secure from end to end. The RSA algorithm used to be proprietary, but now it's been released into the public domain, and we use it extensively on our websites to do SSL, or what's now called TLS types of encryption. If you see anybody using a public or private key encryption mechanism on the internet, there's a good bet that they're using RSA. Another algorithm that is used to protect keys as they are exchanged over the network is called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This is the idea of being able to send keys across the network, but still be ensured that nobody's going to be able to use those keys to decrypt your private information. This key transfer mechanism was published in 1976 by Whitfield Diffie, Martin Hellman, and Ralph Merkle. And one important consideration here is this was really designed to transfer keys across the network. It's not by itself a method of encrypting or authenticating people's communications over the network. This is something that simply allows us to send keys from one end to the other and still protect that key and the method that's going to be used for encrypting data using those keys. It's very common to see Diffie-Hellman key exchange used in things like perfect forward secrecy, which is a way to transfer keys and encrypt information on web servers. This uses ephemeral Diffie-Hellman, which means those keys will only be used for a short period of time. You'll commonly see that written as EDH or DHE, and it's combined with elliptic curve cryptography to be able to do the encryption. So if you ever see a server and it's using a key exchange method of ECDHE, it's really referring to this method that's used that we commonly call perfect forward secrecy.
Okay, so that is a little information information about RSA and Diffie-Hellman and the differences between those. So the Diffie-Hellman key exchange is really just trying to prevent the wrong people from having access to the wrong key, to the right key, you could say. Another form that we'll hear about is the elliptical curve cryptography. So when you think about encryption involving the base of two really, really large prime numbers. What's a prime number, by the way?
A number that's only divisible by one.
One in itself. So 211. 211 is not divisible by anything else. And there's a way to remember which ones are prime and which ones are not, but we don't need to know that for this.
It's like, I don't know, like 6, I don't know.
Yeah, that's-
There's somebody.
That's a long chunk
Junior
of
high
time. But what's different about elliptical curve cryptography? Now again, I'm not a mathematician, and I will never claim to be. In fact, I'm really pretty bad at math. The keys are generated by graphing a point on a curve. The curve is generated through some mathematical formula. The keys are smaller, so it doesn't take a lot of computational power to be able to use ECC. Because of that, ECC is really commonly used on mobile and wireless devices. Because it doesn't take as long to do it and it doesn't take as much power, which makes sense because when you think about it, you want the battery on your cell phone to last as long as it possibly can. And you definitely don't want things like that draining it. So when you think of ECC, think of mobile phones. Another example of something they might ask you, which of the following symmetric algorithms takes the least amount of processing power? ECC, right? Some other encryption types. We need another category. Other. So these are ones that, like, they don't particularly fall into one or the other. A one-time pad is something that cannot be cracked by math. It's only used once. The key is random. There's no mathematical computation that goes into it at all. So it just generates a string of bits and uses that for encryption. Different every single time. New key every time you run it. So from what I've heard, that's very commonly used with like credit card swipers. Because it's one key, it's transmitted, and then it's done.
That's what,
Are you okay?
no, he's driving me crazy with those keys out there.
I know, I was about to like get up. and, like,
Can I shut the door?
I think it's off.
That's what the credit card, the smart chip is.
Yes,
It's the same process.
yes. The key is used once, so if anybody caught it, by the time they catch it, it's too late, and the transaction's already happened, right? Our PGP, our pretty good privacy, is used for emails. That's what PGP is used for, so remember PGP and emails. So it uses a varying number of key bits as high as 2,000 bits. Geez, that's a lot. That's a big key. So that's going to be very, very secure, right? So PGP only used for emails. Any other questions on encryption? I will tell you when you go through and do your Pearson quiz, you might want to do this more than once for this chapter. There's a lot to it. But if you can remember kind of what we've talked about, what we put up on the board, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, I remember it better than I thought I would. When you first wrote that crap on the board, I thought I was screwed. I was going to change my major.
Please don't take it, major. And even if you do, you still have to take this class. It's in all the hardware majors, so.
Did it just like in the last cycle become a requirement?
No. No. It's been that way for at least a year or two.
I was about to say, because I have a buddy who graduated with this like 2 or 3 years ago. He didn't have to take this class.
2 or 3 years ago, they didn't have any certs.
He did. He took like Net Plus, Cisco. I'm not sure if he took one. Did he have to take 8 plus?
He might have come in right when they were starting to change it. And I know like 3 or 4 years ago, we didn't have any certs.
3 or 4 years ago, you didn't have to do any Cisco classes either.
That's what gives you money though. Money in the bank. Okay. So let's talk about hashing. Hashing to me is a whole lot easier than encryption, so we've already got the worst part out. Right? We're already done with that. So hashing is just a summary. it's one way. It can't be decrypted. There's nothing to decrypt. And I'll show you an example. We'll do a lab about why hashing would actually be used. The focus of hashing is integrity. Hashing is to preserve the integrity of a message. So when I talk about integrity, again, I'm saying, okay, from the time I downloaded this file, the website tells me the hash is this. When I run this on my computer to get the hash and the hashes match, I know I had the same file they meant for me to get. Nothing got lost in translation, nothing got altered, either for malicious or non-malicious purposes.
To preserve what now? You said action, now to preserve.
Integrity, file integrity. So a hash function is math. Math's hard. It converts a variable-sized amount of data into a smaller block of data. So if I have 2,000 bits and I have a 128-bit hash, when I use a hash function, I end up with 128 bits. If I have a 64-bit hash, no matter how much data I get, at the end of the day, after the hash function, I have 64 bits to look at. So this is supposed to take arbitrary data, use it as input, and then produce something that's a fixed length. Depending on the kind of hashing that you use, that length will be different. So when we talk about hashing functions, the thing to know about hashing functions is that hashing should be collision resistant. So what does that mean? If I put an input in of this block of text, and then I put an input in of a different block of text, and the hash is the same, that's a collision. That means hash is no good anymore, right? If I'm putting in different inputs and producing the same output, the hash isn't doing me any good, right? So then we get a different kind of hash. It's like encryption. When somebody finds out the key or we break the code, we get a new encryption, right? So that is a collision. So when you see these talked about and you see that they're collision resistant or a collision has been found, that's the same thing as saying it's deprecated, it's no longer in use. So, cryptographic hash functions are based on block ciphers, and they normally have a fixed length of output that they give you. Whereas encryption could be anything, right? So the first one to talk about is MD5, Message Digest 5. We talked about digest when I showed you the picture of the email being sent between Bob and Alice. There was a digest that he sent and then a digest that she had at the very end to verify that it was him that sent the message. So MD5 is the latest one that is used. It uses a 128-bit key, so after you use this MD5 algorithm, you get a block of 128 bits of stuff to compare with. Very widely used. We will go through a lab. There's something that we've already downloaded in this class that had the option to look at the MD5 hash, so we're going to do a lab where we compare the two. The next one is SHA. SHA comes in different flavors. There's SHA-1, there's SHA-2, there's things like that. But that's the secure hash algorithm, very frequently used by the government. Speaking of used by the government, does anybody watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
My roommates were watching it most of the time.
Yeah. Nobody watched? They
I watched
always
the
talk
first-
about RSA encryption.
I watched the first episode and it just wasn't.
Couldn't handle
It's
it.
not good.
You got to get into that one. That one's tough to get. But they always talk about RSA encryption. Oh, they broke our RSA. You know, like it's all, you
It's
know.
not very good.
It's one of those things where they try to make it sound really smart and it's really not.
Right, right. If you didn't know, you'd scan right past it. But now that I know, I'm like,
I always like it when they put a smarter tense in the show.
yes. It's always fun if you know
Yeah.
the difference. So we've got our SHA-1, very commonly used, 160 bits. SHA-2, more bits, so it's better. The more powerful the hashing algorithm is, the more bits that it has, the less likely the collisions will occur. So SHA-1 and SHA-2. Some other ones you don't really hear much about because they're not really used that much, to be being honest. Right, MD, and HMAC. So. Kind of specialized, you don't see them used a whole lot. But again, that's one of those things, like, I just want you to understand that that falls under hashing. So if you got it on another question, you wouldn't go, I don't know what that is, so it's probably the answer. Because you know we all do it. All do it. So I want you to know that that is a hashing technique for that reason. Okay, we're almost done. Joy. When we talk about hashing with passwords, we're going to add that too. There's only 3 of them. Okay, so the landman was used in really primitive versions of Windows, I think up to XP. Then when we got to Vista, we started into the NTLM hash.
What is Windows Vista?
Huh?
What is Windows Vista?
What is it? It's an operating system.
I know that. I was just like, you know the.
Have you just blacked it out from your mind?
Yeah.
It was just so painful for you?
It was bad.
I know.
Everyone says. That's why
Do
I
you
said
remember
it.
Windows Millennium Edition?
No.
You're too young. Do you
I had
really?
on the shop.
I had Windows
Yeah,
Millennium.
Windows 95.
Yeah, it was not good.
And then I didn't go too long.
That was the old Windows Vista.
I remember seeing it.
That was the first one.
Yeah, it was iteration 1. So the landman hash is what we used XP and previous for Windows passwords. So it's based on the DES algorithm, which that's deprecated, which means landman will be too because it's based on something that we don't use anymore, right? This was the hash to store Windows passwords, as I said. Now, think back to, a couple weeks ago when we did a password cracking lab, and we used the XP tables. So I gave you a hash, and then you had to go through and crack to find out what that hash was. What did that password consist of? Do you remember anything about that?
It was just numbers and letters.
It was numbers and letters. It was capital and lowercase and a number, I think.
Yeah.
There was no special characters. There was nothing else to that. So it wasn't a great password to begin with. But at the time when XP came out, that's what we had, right? I guess they thought, it's a workstation. You got to be in front of it. It doesn't matter. So that hash that we got, that we used to get the actual 8-bit password, because that's all it could be at the time was 8 bits, was the landman hash. So we've already used that before. So that's the problem with landman, is it's only upper and lowercase letters and numbers. It's only 8 bits. And actually in the process of using the landman hash, they take those 8 bits and they break them apart and they hash them separately. So really it's only 4 bits of information you have to figure out to get close. So that's why we don't use landman anymore, long story short. Then we got to the NTLM hash. It was backwards compatible for older systems, but it uses the RC4 cipher. So now we're using something a little more current for NTLM. Then we moved to the second version of that. Well, now we started hashing with MD5, which is the most difficult one to crack. So that became the updated version of that newer versions of Windows use. A couple more things to remember about password hashing. Key stretching, if you have a weak key, maybe your key's like 32 bits or something, which is really easy for a computer to be able to get past. How long did it take for y'all to crack the passwords in that lab? Do you remember?
It was like a minute or something.
A minute?
12 seconds, something like that. I'll go back and look at it. Let's see.
That was one of the questions in the lab. When I did it, it took like less than a second. I mean, maybe I just had a good computer. I don't know, but it took me like less than a second to crack 8 bits. So if you have a weak key and you try to enhance it and turn it into something stronger, we call that key stretching.
A minute and 12 seconds.
12 seconds,
A
okay.
minute and
12
A
seconds.
minute and 12 seconds. Wow, that took longer.
It was a long hash, really. It was pretty long. That was the hash you gave us.
Yeah. I'm surprised it took that long. For me, it was really quick. Yeah. It's still not that long if you're waiting to break someone's password so you can steal information. So there are programs that do the key stretching for you. One of them is called bcrypt. That will make the key from weak to strong so that you can use it again. Salting is just adding random stuff into whatever you're doing, so it makes it harder to figure out. Some other things to remember: the complexity and the length of the password definitely come into place when you're talking about password hashing. The strength of your password overall, if it's got numbers and characters and things like that in it, upper, lowercase, it's going to be stronger, so that's going to help with hashing. Limit the number of times a password can be typed in. So we know that, especially as a server administrator, if somebody's trying to type in their own password 3 times and they get it wrong all 3 times, we probably ought to lock them out and make them call us to get it fixed, because it could be somebody maliciously trying to get in their account. They could also have caps lock on, but just to be safe, lockouts and things like that are used for that. It also stops a brute force attack. If somebody is sitting in front of their computer trying to figure out what their password is, they're typing in their grandkid's name and their dog's name and all the things that people use for their passwords very frequently. Those are some things that will help thwart a brute force attack. There's a couple password hashing things to talk about for one-time passwords.
If you've ever authenticated to a resource using multiple forms or factors of authentication, you've probably used a username, a password, and probably some type of one-time password. In this video, we'll look at a couple of different ways to provide this one-time password functionality. One-time passwords are passwords that we use a single time and we never use them ever again. These passwords may be useful for a single session, or they may really be used every time we want to authenticate, and then whether we get the authentication correct or incorrect, we're never going to use that one-time password again. One common way of providing this one-time password is through something called HOTP. That stands for HMAC-based one-time password algorithm. And it uses a keyed hash message authentication code, or an HMAC. This message authentication code is something that's going to pop up on the screen, and it's all based on a secret key and a counter that is in place. And this message that pops up is the one that we're going to use as our one-time password. We commonly see this used on token-based authentication. We're carrying around different kinds of tokens. I have a token here, and that one-time password would pop up on my token generator, and that's what I would use to be able to authenticate. Every time you try to authenticate, every time you push the button on that token authenticator, it's going to give you a different hash every time. There are both hardware and software tokens that you can get to do this. So you're going to need some type of additional technology to make this work, either something physical that people can take along with them, or you'll need to install software on mobile devices that people carry with them. TOTP stands for time-based one-time password. In a time-based one-time password, you're going to get a certain password based on whatever time of the day it happens to be. This is a little bit different than the HOTP we were just talking about, where you got a password based on a counter. Every time you use that password, the counter would then increment. In the case of TOTP, it just depends on what time of day it happens to be, and that's what's going to synchronize these passwords together on both your side and on the resource. For time-based passwords, obviously time synchronization is very important. So you'll need to define a secret key and then timestamp and have everything synchronized via a standard protocol such as network time protocol. These timestamps usually increment every 30 seconds or so, although this value can be changed by the administrator. So you would put in your username and your password, and you would put in whatever the latest 30-second code happened to be. And if you didn't get that right, you may have to restart the process, and if 30 seconds have gone by, you may have to input a different password because the time of the day is now different. This is a very common way to provide one-time passwords. If you're using a separate one-time password generator for Google, for Facebook, or for Microsoft, then you're probably using TOTP.
Or if you're logging into your Blizzard account.
Yeah, I've done that for years.
Yeah. Okay, so, in our, how do I, on earth do I remember this section here? We have our symmetric, asymmetric, our other, I think we have PGP, we can add to that as well. Quantum cryptography, we didn't talk about, it's super out there, but that is another asymmetric way. It's not really used yet. It's kind of a theory. And then our different hashing algorithms, with the last three being part of password hashing specifically. So again, what I would want you to know for the test is the names, what category they fit in, and whether they're still used or not. That is what, in my experience, you would need to know to be successful.